your mom and dad? Just your mother, what she was like, big woman, little woman, her personality, her
Yeah.
the memories you have of her as a little kid and as a teenager maybe, and so on.
Well, my mother was, I would say, about medium size, and we have pictures of her around here somewhere that you could look at. She was a very, very kind, considerate, sweet person, I thought. We all did. Loved her very dearly. And always willing to do what we could to make her task easier, you know. And so it was a happy relationship that we all had with Mother and Dad. Of course, when times were tough, of course, Dad would be worrying about how to support the family and this, that. So there'd be these little frictions, maybe, you know. It happens in every
Sure, sure.
But we managed to come through. She, as I mentioned earlier, was born on Raiatea and went to school there. How the two met, I forget now. I think he was visiting the island, and they met and married very quickly. Dad was educated in the States.
The United States.
He went through schools in Tahiti and then came to Oakland, where he attended the Johns Hopkins Military Academy in those days. And when he graduated from that, he went to the University of California. But then the Depression in the 80s, I forget exactly dates, struck, and it was no longer, he was no longer able to. In those days, you couldn't work, I don't suppose, to support yourself. Anyway, to make a long story short, Grandfather Walker said, I can no longer, you know, give you the funds to carry on, and so forth. He was trending toward medicine. And that's why later on he was so good at homeopathics. He understood the whole thing. So I guess the bottom line is we were a pretty happy family. And
he was around a lot. I mean, they were, your mom and dad were.
They were well thought of. My Aunt Maud, who married the principal of the school that I attended.
Mr. On,
yeah. A-H-N-N-E. She used to have tea parties every Wednesday or Thursday, and Mother would always be invited. And she got to meet a lot of the other ladies in town, all very proper, influential people, you know.
Actually, educators were a very well revered part of the society then. Wasn't that the truth?
Right.
I mean, the importance of an education was very well understood, huh?
Oh yes, and it was the good old, you know, 3 R's. And
Well, they were public schools, private, and then.
Well, initially they were schools, the Protestants and the Catholic school, and then a little later on the public schools came on. So today you have those three classifications, and then the church, some of the churches like the Adventists have their own schools too, but they still have to all intent and purposes, be a public school first and secondarily a religious school.
They have to teach the basics, and then they can still teach the religion in addition.
Right.
Yeah. So your aunt was an educator, your Aunt Maud, or was she a teacher?
No, she was married to the principal.
Married to the principal of the school.
Yeah.
Okay.
But she did a lot through the women's groups, you know, and that helped. The principal's name was Edouard and he was a very energetic person. I remember he was the agent for the Peugeot bicycles and ultimately cars. And I bought my first Peugeot from him. What I did was, during the vacation period, I got my father to agree to let me make copra from the coconut trees we had on the farm or plantation. And I got sufficient to almost pay for the bicycle. He made up the difference.
Oh, isn't that nice?
But I had from then on I rode to school on a bicycle. Prior to that time we had to walk to school.
How big was your land there? even in
It's
those
not
days.
as
I
big
realize now it's.
Yeah, it's not as big as it is now. But, golly.
Did that come from the Raiatea connection of the family? No.
No, that came from the Walker. Originally, when they were first married, my father and mother lived around the districts, let's see, just beyond Papua.
Mm-hmm.
And that was owned by my paternal grandfather, and my father ran the place for him. It was a fairly large plantation.
How did he originally bought the land then when he came?
He lived in town, but he also ultimately bought land.
So he was very wise in the sense of
Yeah.
looking forward to owning land. Huh?
So ultimately, Dad wanted to be on his own, so he bought this land in Hamilton, which is a very short distance from town. as you
Sure.
know. And he ran a dairy, a small dairy. We delivered milk to town, and of course the coconut trees gave us revenue through copra. And amazingly, with the revenue from those two products, he kept the family going.
His 9 children, yeah. That's
Oiled them, fed them, educated them.
You know, it's funny because I can remember my aunts and uncles in Fresno have told me how my grandfather got started there. He had a ranch and he had 4 boys, 5 boys and 3 girls. And when he had the boys, they worked, you know, and so he could take a place and work it. So he bought his first place for maybe $50. And then he got to know the banker, and they knew the Mesples worked very hard. So there was another place that was going bankrupt. You know, I mean, the man lost his farm, and he came to my grandfather and said, "You have boys, can you work this ranch? Here, it's going to cost you $50 to buy this 20 acres. I know you don't have the money. Here's $50. Give it back to me, and the ranch is yours." Because they knew that he would take care of it.
Yeah.
And so as a result, you know, 20 years ago, they owned square miles, you know, I mean, a section and that sort of thing. And it was because, maybe in a sense like your father, he had a family that could take care and work the place, huh? Is that kind of how it worked?
That's right, that's right. The big plateau, which we call Peacock Hill, which is the plateau where Hilda lives, and the development beyond that where Rudy Bainbridge came into the picture, all that was under cultivation. We raised corn.
Oh, boy.
And other fruits, and that helped the dairy and all the people.
Sure.
And
so, and then each of the kids worked there, and as they had kids, they worked, or you could hire people too, I'm sure.
My recollection of what happened, you see, the war came along in what, 1914?
14.
And my 2 eldest brothers were drafted, of course. One, Teddy.
Did they go to war for France or for England?
No, for France.
For France, because you were a French colony.
Yeah, at that time. Everett never got to Europe. He was on his way, and the ship went from Tahiti to New Caledonia and then on to Europe. And when they arrived in New Caledonia, it was at a bad time. They had a spinal meningitis epidemic, apparently. And he got it and died there. He never moved.
One of your brothers?
Yeah, the second one.
Second over.
Everett. Brother Teddy got to as far as France, and he was wounded in one of his legs, I forget which one. And ultimately came home after the war. He didn't come home immediately as a sergeant in the French army. And he settled in, well, he was trying to get started somehow in town. He worked for a couple of stores. The history is very blurred right now on how he managed. Ultimately, he moved back to Hamilton because Dad's deeded part of the property there to him, and that's where he raised his family. The first wife he had, who was Clet's mother, died, and I don't remember exactly when, but you know, these epidemics would come through there and decimate.
That was Clet's mom then.
Yes. And I don't know how long after her death, Teddy remarried, and that's Ernest's mother.
Oh, I see. Uh-huh. So Clet was kind of raised by his stepmother then.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Incidentally, his mother was a lovely person too.
Mm-hmm.
They all were in those days, you know. Kind, considerate, hardworking, loving.
Yeah. Still proper though, kind of, huh? I mean,
Oh, yes.
was that
Oh, yes.
was that the time? I mean,
Yeah.
it was not like we get a big hug from Grandpa, but
Yeah,
that probably that
little
was
reserved.
a little reserved. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Did Nunu was telling me that they had a cook and they had a maid and a house cleaner. Did you have that sort of thing too?
No, we did all
Did all that
ourselves.
yourselves?
See, her father worked for the German trading company called SCO, Société Commerciale de l'Océanie,
Mm-hmm.
and they were all Germans.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, my Uncle Charlie Brown bought that business.
Oh. When they had to leave during the war then,
Yeah.
huh? So your Uncle Charlie Brown was your
Charlie Brown married Mary Ann Higgins.
Okay.
So through the Higgins connection, I was related.
Okay, so that was your Aunt Mary Ann Higgins.
That's right. Aunt Mary Ann and Mother. I think Aunt Mary Ann was older than Mother,
Mm-hmm.
as I recall it. But Charlie Brown really prospered. He built quite a empire down
Mm-hmm.
there.
Mm-hmm.
That's-
So he actually bought the trading company that the Moyles had been involved and worked for.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Iron Walker.
Just interrupted by a little phone call, and we were talking about Charlie, your Uncle Charlie Brown. He was not still alive. When,
Oh yes.
he is still alive. How?
No. He
No,
died.
no. Who is the one who is alive? We call Charlie Brown. That's his son.
No, that's him.
When you talk about when Chuck was in Tahiti, who did he meet on Raiatea, or not Raiatea? When we went on
Charlie Higgins.
Charlie Higgins.
Yeah. Charlie Higgins was the son of Stephen Higgins, who was the baby of the family.
He's the one that. Okay, your mom's saying he's the one that had the what do you call it? The marina?
Mhm.
Is that the one that has
Yeah.
the marina in
Raiatea.
Raiatea?
I don't know whether he still has it.
But I mean, but Chuck
Yeah.
got off the boat there and went and spent an hour with him. That's him, huh?
Yeah.
And so that's Stephen Higgins, your mother's youngest
Right.
brother's son.
Son.
Okay. Okay.
Now where were we?
I'm sorry. We were talking about Charlie Brown having kind of took over the oceanic
Yeah.
business there, and
The
yeah, and I was kind of asking how you. I mean, did you folks basically work the ranches yourselves and the family, and so your mom did all the cooking and
Yeah.
and all of that there.
Her family
and
was
how
a little different because he was a businessman, you know.
Mm-hmm.
The revenue coming into the family was from his wages and
Mm-hmm.
whatever did other business or investments he had. We were self-sufficient, had to be self-sufficient.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Dad didn't work in town.
The property you had where you lived, was that like 20 acres, 10 acres? And I realized there was other property up the hill and everything. It was a pretty sizable.
The immediate, no, we had two plateaus, the same two plateaus we have now. And, couple of 100 hectares.
That's 400 acres. That's pretty good size.
But the land extends clear back to
Yes.
almost to our.
Yeah, now it goes way
Yeah.
back. But in those days, in other words, you lived kind of on a couple hundred
Yeah.
hectares, and you ranched that part of it, as it
That's
were.
right. And we got up on Peacock Hill, one of the plateaus
Mhm.
facing on the Papeete side,
Mm-hmm.
and we farmed that.
How did you get in those days? How could you hiked, huh? I mean, or
Oh,
did
yeah.
you had a horse, your legs, and you had a horse maybe haul stuff up for you, or
Yeah, and bicycles.
bicycle even? I mean, you make a little small road. You'd have to chop down the.
Well, we had it pretty well cleared.
But I mean, somebody had to do the
Yeah,
clearing.
initially.
Huh? Initially.
Yeah,
Because that was all wild forest. I mean, wasn't
that's
it?
right. Guava trees and
Uh-huh.
ferns and what have you.
Uh huh.
I forget how Dad plowed the plateau now.
Probably had a horse and a plow, huh?
Yeah, yeah. And somewhere along the line we got mechanical help.
Mm-hmm.
And we built a silo, I remember, for storage of the corn stalks for the dairy.
See, today, Noella's brother Herman, who used to be a woodworker, I mean, he made beautiful furniture. He's retired, and she has flowers and does fleurie for the mayor, for the governor, for all the, all year round. She makes flowers. They have a hot house near their home, Aruwe, I guess, before Mahina. Is that Aruwe?
Yeah.
Okay, they live there in Aruwe. But then way out in Hitia, up on the hill, they have some property there, and he had to go in and clean, and he showed me. They went with machete and chopped down. I mean, that's a workout. Even today, they still have to do that to clear it. I mean, if you want to plant, they plant these beautiful big red peacock flowers and all the different flowers that they use, And so since he's retired from woodworking, he's gone out there, and he's the one that works, and his little grandson.
Native workers are great, very proficient.
Boy, that machete, does the job. And they've taken water that comes down from up above, and he's captured it, and he sends it off here, there, and he can put his, he has a spigot, turns it on, and the pressure is enough to sprinkle and water, and it's just amazing. And that's obviously what you had to do in the first place to.
Well, let's get back to my graduation. After
Okay.
I graduated, I got a job for working for my uncle in the shipyard. He had a shipyard, Uncle Charlie,
In Tahiti.
in Papeete Harbor,
Oh.
yes. And Stephen Higgins ultimately took over the management of that from Charlie Brown. And I worked for Steve until I left for the States. And that's how I
And
came
you were
to-
doing what kind? I'm just curious.
Well, I was doing clerical work, going around collecting the bills
All right.
and making up the invoices and so forth.
Not working on the boats and stuff. It was
Well,
more.
when I was caught up with the paperwork and so forth, I went in the factory, so to speak.
Good.
And helped wherever I could. There were
Mhm.
boat builders there.
Sure.
They needed an extra pair of hands, and I
Sure.
pitched in and helped.
Good.
And in the meanwhile, I had applied through the American consul for a visa to come to the States. And when the happy day arrived, I didn't tell my Uncle Steve ahead of time what I had in mind. But when the day arrived, I had to tell him that I had received my visa and that the first opportunity I'd be leaving for the States. I had accumulated a little money working for him,
How old were you then, if I could ask? Probably
19.
19?
Then the trip to San Francisco, that's another interesting
Yes.
story. The Uncle Charlie, owning the SCO and so forth, in connection with, conjunction rather with a firm in San Francisco, O'Connor, bought a motor ship called the Beulah. And the Beulah used to run between San Francisco and Tahiti and back, general merchandise carrier. We used to import, when I was Williams Diamond, import a lot of vanilla beans and other pearl shell and all that sort of thing. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. I, through my uncle, of course, and his influence, I got passage on the Beulah as a passenger. And it took us, I think, almost 20 days from Tahiti to San Francisco. We broke down a couple of times. Diesel engines in those days, were not too reliable, but we had a good chief engineer and he worked on it, but it took time. Anyway, I ultimately got to San Francisco, and a little human interest story there. I forget what time of the year it was. I think it was March, April. I was out on deck in shorts and a short sleeve coat, shirt. And the immigration man spotted me across, and he says, "Aren't you cold?" And I said, "Well, I don't feel it. You know, I mean, I'm enjoying this cool weather after the hot weather in Tahiti."
Yeah.
He said, "You better get a coat on, or a jacket of some kind." He said, "This weather is tricky, you know, it's foggy and stuff." So I followed his instructions. And anyway, I landed in San Francisco and lived with my uncle Warren Higgins and Esther Higgins. Albert was living with them at the time. My brother Ed, who had preceded me, was living in Oakland. He had, through George Golds, gotten a job in the Union Diesel Engine Company in Oakland. So he was living in Oakland with Henry Golds, who was George's brother. Then I got to San Francisco, and Frank Kugelberg, who was the import manager and had been to Tahiti many times, and I had met him down there, was instrumental in finding me a job until there was an opening in Williams Diamond and Company. And that job was in the Carton Label Corporation, where we made labels for fruit cans, you know, and all that sort of thing. Those colored labels. We did, of course, other type of printing too. That job lasted a few months until the opening came at Williams Diamond. So I went to Williams Diamond and Company as office boy, my first job. One of the senior partners, Warren B. Clark, welcomed me with open arms. He had been the agent for my grandfather Higgins, Williams Diamond, and the initial company before they merged into Williams Diamond. So he wanted to know all about what had happened in the islands, you know, since my grandfather had dropped out of the picture. And that helped me, you know, immensely in the firm. And I just busted my butt, you know, doing anything and everything that I could.
Sure.
And I stayed with them for 21 years.
My goodness.
Until the war came along, and then I was war shipping.
Question about Mr. Ed Goltz. How is, they were related to you?
Yes. The
Explain
Goltz
that.
family, Mabel Higgins, who was my mother's sister, married the Goltz.
Okay.
And they had a family of about 6. That's where George and Henry came into the picture. So we're cousins, first cousins.
First cousins. And Charlotte married Ed Goltz? Charlotte was Ed Goltz's wife?
No, Charlotte was a Goltz herself.
Okay. She never married then?
Never married.
She lived in that big house in Tahiti?
Yeah, that was the Brown house.
Okay.
Charlie Brown's house.
Okay.
Of course, when Uncle Charlie passed away, and incidentally, Aunt Mary Ann preceded him in death. After Uncle Charlie passed away, the Bambridges moved in on us and permitted her to live in a guest house on the same lot. The big house was occupied by the Bambridges.
Terrible, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How that evolved, George Bambridge, the Bambridges had a business of their own. George Bambridge worked himself into my uncle's good graces and ultimately became a vice president of the SCO and borrowed a lot of money from Uncle Charlie and, you know, improved his lot one way or the other. And his grandson, Rudy Bambridge, was the one who hurt my uncle and Aunt Mary Ann. But They literally swiped everything. And the big lawsuit that we finally brought after 20 years and so forth still hasn't been settled. It looks more favorable for the family to recover, but a lot of the money which the Bambridges appropriated has disappeared. Rudy Bambridge died at a young age. He was driving home from visiting a concubine one night, early morning, and he drove off the road over into a cliff, down a cliff. So that took care of him. The other one who was mixed up with him died a horrible death. He developed, I forget what it was, cancer of the lung or something. So those two got what was coming to them, so to speak. And but the estate was all, jumbled up. And Charlie Higgins and our family, Clet and our family, financed this new suit that was brought against the
Bambridge.
estate, the Bambridges.
Hasn't there have been some positive decisions in that, correct?
Yes, yes.
But it's still not finally finished?
Not yet.
It's in France now?
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
Cour de Cassation, which is the highest court in the land.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
The notary who worked with the Bambridges on this thing was a man named, he was right in with them, and he, through his fees, exorbitant fees, amassed quite a fortune of his own. I haven't had too much information from Tahiti on how this happened, but the High Court declared him innocent of a lot of these accusations, and he has disposed of his business in Tahiti and is moving back to France to, money talks.
Sure.
For himself. But the Bambridges are still facing this suit.
And
things drag on.
You would have the opportunity to recover land? Is that kind of basically
Yes,
what it is?
The big store in Papete,
Yes. So it would be land in that store, but not necessarily a lot of money because they've kind of stashed all that, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or spent it.
Or spent it, yeah.
My Uncle Charlie left an estate estimated to be $350 million.
Whew.
That translates into trillions of francs.
Sure. Yeah. Wow. Wow. So the partage that is going on now, that's independent of all of that other lawsuit, right?
It's reopening the old one.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of good information has come out, in our favor and all that. I'm an heir intestate, but I contributed to the defense, to the prosecution of this second case. So through that avenue, so to speak, something is going to come back to us, Hiram Walker and his family. But what percentage, nobody knows yet.
Yeah.
First you have to determine how much is going to come back.
How much will come back, and then the division will come.
In the meanwhile, the revenue from the rentals of the big firm and big building in town have been impounded, so to speak. And a portion of it used, of course, to maintain the building. That's building up. And here again in that family, of course, Denise Higgins, who married in this country and divorced, lived with Uncle Charlie and Mary Ann. They literally adopted her. When this case went against us initially, she didn't get much, if anything, and ultimately moved to France to live. When we revived this suit, she took the position that she didn't want to be involved, that she didn't have anything to contribute, and so forth. And so it fell to our lot, to the Walkers, primarily until cousin Charlie Higgins sold some property and contributed from his side.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really Charlie Higgins and the Walkers who started this second suit and contributed to
The financing of it.
Now Denise wrote letters to one of my cousins, who was the son of Dolly Higgins, one of Steve Higgins' daughters, saying that she was renouncing all claim to any. And today, she is back as the #1 heiress. How that was worked, I don't know. And with
She didn't want to spend anything to try to help, but then now that
now
it...
she, yeah. C'est comme ça that I want.
Oui, yeah. Ay, 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 yeah.
So every family is.
Yes, yes. And that this is with big family to start way back and more big families, it makes it very difficult.
Yeah.
Makes it very difficult.
It's a real can of worms.
Real can of worms. Well, I'm happy that some of it is coming kind of to fruition anyway, or at
I
least...
hope so.
Yeah.
I see it in my lifetime, and that
Yeah.
remains to be seen.
Yeah. Back to when you were in San Francisco, when you worked for Williams Diamond, you started out just... Then you got into the actual shipping documents.
Yeah, actually, what I ultimately wound up in was the import department, headed up by Frank Kugelberg.
Okay.
And I worked with them.
Not only things from Tahiti then, but from Australia,
Yeah.
from all over the world.
Yeah.
France would
Yeah.
come to San Francisco.
Yeah.
And was that a shipping company or was it a
Well,
freight forwarder?
we were steamship agents
Okay.
and commission agents. We bought and sold merchandise for people.
Oh.
We exported as well as imported.
So people would command you to go out and buy, and you would, for a certain commission,
Yeah.
do
And
that?
then the export department to handle the shipping of those products.
Okay, so you were the agent and the commission purchaser and seller. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the steamship agency end of it grew substantially. And after the import section sort of sloughed off, Tahiti imports and so forth, I worked into the steamship agency branch of the company. And I remained there. We had the Quaker line, we had the Japanese line, the OSK line, and this was big revenue producing accounts, you know. And we had the German line, and
So you would actually arrange for the loading of the ships, making
Yeah.
sure the
and
cargo
going out
was
and
there?
getting the cargo to fill the ships and so forth.
Okay. Okay.
Now the Quaker line, which was an intercoastal line, headquartered in Portland, made things a little tough for us. When the lumber trade was good and the demand for lumber on the East Coast was heavy, they cut our allocation of space way back, you know. But they still gave us enough to take care of the dried fruit and the canned goods shipping to the East Coast. Del Monte was one of our big accounts. California Packing was another big one. And FM Ball was good canned goods and so forth.
So this was in like in the 30s, late 30s?
Yeah.
Mid to late 30s, huh? Were things pretty good even though the Depression had hit?
Oh yes, we managed. I mean,
And there still wasn't a lot of railroad traveling, or did you compete with the railroads
we
even then?
competed with the railroads.
Trucks weren't really doing
Nothing at all.
nothing at all in those days. Trucks were just local delivery stuff, huh?
That's right.
Okay.
So I grew up in the steamship end from then on. And when the World War came along, of course, I was with War Shipping Administration.
Explain that. Just give a.
Yeah.
I've heard this and that.
Before when was it now? Anyway, I was the president of the American Hawaiian Steamship Company, which was an offshoot of original Williams Diamond Company. Some senior partners went off and created the American Hawaiian Steamship Company, which was strictly an intercoastal line, very substantial. Mr. Cushing, who was president of American Hawaiian Steamship Company at that time, they were looking for people to work for war shipping in these various branch offices. And my first tour of duty with War Shipping Administration was in San Francisco as manager of the Cargo Clearance Office. We were in the war at that time, and my job was to issue permits, ODT permits, Office of Defense Transportation permits, for commercial cargo on these vessels that were handling primarily military cargo, but with a certain allocation of space for commercials. We had to keep supplying our allies and so forth and so on. So I issued the permits to move that cargo from warehouse to destination. And there again we had competition between merchants, you know, who were trying to get space and couldn't. And one little story, I remember one firm, Otis McAllister and Company, who were big in Central America, couldn't get space on the Grace Line because the Grace Line, I mean the W.R. Grace rather, were in the import-export business themselves. So it came to a point where I had to get the vice presidents of the W.R. Grace Company and Otis McAllister in my office. And I said, we're here to see that everybody gets a fair share of space to carry on the business in these countries and so forth and so on. Make a long story short, the W.R. Grace man finally backed down and said, okay, what we did was to alternate. They'd get space this week, and next week Otis McAllister would get space. And it was settled and
it worked out, yeah. You just had to use a little, get their heads together, right?
Now that job lasted about 8 months.
Still in the, like 1940, 41 then?
Yeah. I went back to Williams Diamond where I wanted to be, you know. And I was there a short time when Mr. Cushing says, I need you in Pearl Harbor. You know, port representative in Pearl Harbor. Well, what am I going to do there? He says, we're going to have to keep track of all the commercial vessels operating in the Pacific. See, when the Army Navy went in on moving in, let's say, on Okinawa and so forth, they had 3 or 4 echelons of ships. The assault people went in first, and then secondarily they had the early support deal, and then subsequently the type of support, not only military but commercial also, you know, to feed these people.
Sure.
So my job was to coordinate, well, first of all, keep track of all these vessels in the Pacific, and we had messages filtering into the Honolulu office from all over, including San Francisco, where the ships were, when they were expected to hit Pearl, and we deviated a lot of them to Pearl Harbor if the demand was urgent. Otherwise, we let them go back to the coast of San Francisco and Oakland. So I was out there for, what, 18 months, till the war was, Japan was over. Then I couldn't get out of there fast enough. But I enjoyed that tour of duty. I got to know a lot of fine people in the Navy, the commercial people in Honolulu.
So you had to coordinate really with everybody. I mean, if they needed something, you were the one that could see that it got there.
Yeah, and one of the things I needed to know before we allocated these ships was what, if any, a way of repairs they needed, you know. And the repair work was all done in the shipyard in Pearl Harbor. And so I had to work with the Navy shipyard coordinating the repairs of these ships. It was an extremely interesting job.
I mean, you also, these ships ran the fear of being bombed and all that too.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you could lose ships with cargo, and then you had to replace cargo, and I mean that.
That's right. But that happened. When I was there were very few of those incidents.
Okay, that was more.
The Navy had things pretty well under control. A little human interest story there too. I'll come back to it.
Okay. Yeah. So then that was after the war. Then you came back to Williams Diamond.
Yeah. As
And Nunu told me that you started living a little distraction from the work for a minute. When you got married, you lived in a little place across the street on Eunice from where you eventually bought your home.
yeah,
That's where you.
yeah, they had a downstairs apartment.
Uh-huh.
Incidentally, he was a professor of music at the University of California,
Uh-huh.
and we rented the downstairs small apartment. It was a one-bedroom, living room, kitchen, bathroom,
Uh-huh.
and ultimately, Glenn Hayden moved back to Carolinas to teach back there. He got a better job, so we rented the house, the main house so we moved upstairs. And ultimately, we bought across the street.
2136.
Yeah,
Eunice.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you lived there until you moved to Seattle.
that's right.
Okay. Back to after the war, then you came back to San Francisco.
Yeah, but that tour duty in the islands was really, really something.
Did Nunu get to go over there with you? No, she had to stay.
No women allowed, no family allowed.
Yeah, no family. Yeah.
Housing was difficult, you know. At one time, rather, there were over 400,000 people living on the island, passing through the island. I came back to William Diamond and Company, and as office manager, I guess it was. But again, concentrating in the shipping end of it, you know. The war cleanup and all these, all these agencies we had been allocated by War Shipping Administration. We must have had half a dozen of them.
Probably didn't hurt to have had your experience in Hawaii.
Right.
You picked up some plums, probably, huh? Kind of, yeah.
And then that became a job there of coordinating the movement of those ships and repairs and so forth and so on. First thing I did when a ship would come into port is get down there with the port engineer and sit down with the port engineer to work the ship and determine what repairs, if any, he needed, how urgent he was, could he get by with less or more, et cetera, et cetera. And then work the ships back into service to the, because even after the war, war shipping was still involved in resupplying a lot of these countries, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I did that then from Williams Diamond and Company. Worked long hours, practically every night. And I was living in Berkeley at the commute.
Take the old red train, did you? Or you used to drive?
Yeah.
Take the train, yeah. Because it stopped right there at Berryman Station, right?
That's right, very close by.
Yeah.
Then, as time went on, the vice president of Williams Diamond and Company, who was very close to Paul Fagan, decided they'd start up a new steamship company, Trans-Pacific. And Richard McLaren asked me if I'd join him. I debated it for quite a while. I talked to my senior, the president of Williams Diamond and Company. And Richard McLaren was concerned about the future of Williams Diamond. Right after the war, you know, it was come see, come saw. Today they're still prospering. But anyway, he and Paul Fagan decided that they'd start up this new steamship company. They got some pretty influential people around San Francisco to join them in financing this venture. For instance, a fellow Haas, Levi Strauss was one, and half a dozen good wealthy businessmen around town. So we started up Pacific Transport Lines.
Again, you don't own ships. You merely...
Now this time we own ships.
Oh, okay.
This time we own ships. And initially the idea was to operate these ships between San Francisco, Los Angeles, Hawaii, and the Far East. Ultimately it boiled down to just San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles to the Far East. We didn't stop and come over. Because Matson was getting ideas of their own, you know, about extending to the Far East, we heard. So I was with Pacific Transport Lines, oh, let's see how long. Three or 4 years. And things got a little mixed up there. We hired a vice president who was a fellow named Mate Pennington, who was from Washington. He was Californian who had moved back there in a government job. And he was hired as vice president. And he liked to have his pets around, you know, the company and so forth. Things got a little mixed up. And I finally pretty well made up my mind I would leave Pacific Transport Lines. I had talked to Dick McLaren several times about it, and ultimately a job was offered to me by American Mail Line. I knew Worth Fowler, who was the vice president of American Mail Line, and Blitner, who had been the top man for War Shipping Administration in San Francisco when I was out in Pearl Harbor.
So you actually had worked with him,
Yeah.
knew him pretty well then,
And
yeah.
he knew me pretty well.
Sure.
So the job, there was an opening in their company, the American Mail Line in Seattle, as traffic manager. And it hit me at the time, as I say, when I was a little unhappy at Pacific Transport Lines. So I was making $1,000 a month with Pacific Transport Lines. The American Mail Line offered me $750. And I debated at great length about joining them, you know, and finally resulted in Lintner came to San Francisco on business once. I met him and stayed with him at the Palace Hotel. And to make a long story short, he said, now you start with us at $750 a month. And he said, the way things are going, within a year, you probably should be back where you are now. Well, it took me 2 years. He was one of these old Brooklyn people, you know.
Sales, he was giving you the sales pitch.
Yeah. But I was with American Mail Line for 23 years.
When did you move to Seattle? What year was that?
1950.
1950.
March.
March of 50.
Started working March 1st.
March 1st.
And I retired in 1973, the end of September,
Uh-huh. Been just about 20 years then.
as senior vice president.
Mm-hmm.
I missed out on the presidency because certain people in the company said, well, you know, he's good at traffic and sales and all that, but he lacks some, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I disputed that, but I lost out. Anyway, I had to retire. Of course, in those days, you had to retire at 65.
Sure.
So the first of the month, October 1st, I was gone, the end of September. And you know what happened? Within a month, the American Mail Line was gobbled up by the American Present Lines, who had been buying stock in the American Mail Line quietly at first and openly later. So the people who remained in American Mail Line, who were vice presidents and so forth, lost their titles, and they were sort of shuffled around, so to speak. So I left just in time.
Perfect. You got your full retirement and
Yeah.
didn't lose, yeah. Wow.
I did a foolish thing, of course. Later I took, instead of waiting around for my pension to come along, I took a lump sum settlement.
Mm-hmm.
It worked well for a while. A friend of mine and I went into the business very modestly at first, thank God. That didn't pan out. So
Mm-hmm. You were doing commission type or representation
Yeah.
type work?
mhm.
Mm-hmm. So American Mail no longer exists. It's all part
No.
of it. Is APL still goes,
Yeah, APL at that time was privately owned. Now they're publicly owned.
publicly owned.
That happened 10 years later.
Uh-huh. So you, when you were there and senior vice president and all, this was a lot of trips, I remember, to the Far East.
Yes, yes.
It was all in
You see, I had
keeping your boats full, huh?
I had the responsibility of handling all the agencies in the Far East. The pricing and so forth was under my jurisdiction. So I had to attend these owners' meetings in the Far East, that alternated between the Far East and the U.S. And these top people in these individual companies would attend these meetings because it was all policy decisions, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I got to know a lot of fine people, some not so good. A lot of Japanese, of course. I got to know by first name.
Mm-hmm. Hong Kong, was that big for you folks too?
Yes. That was a separate conference. We had what we call conferences.
Mm-hmm.
Steamship lines would bind together in a conference. We'd have a common tariff of rates. But there were outside competition also, and that we had to watch it, work on rate structures and so forth.
How often were you allowed to change rate structures? Could you?
It depended on the circumstances.
You weren't governed by the government of the United States or the
No.
government of any country. It was all independent, really capitalistic business, huh?
Yeah, all we had to do for war shipping, I mean, maritime administration, was to file out tariffs. And unless they had a complaint from somebody, you know, they
Mhm.
didn't bother us at all.
Did you run into the thing of other companies subsidizing their steamship lines, and therefore you?
Yeah, it was a subtle thing. The Japanese, for instance, had their ways and means of rebating under the table, you know.
Sure.
And we became aware of what was going on because the shippers and consignees would tell us.
Sure.
And the question was, how do we meet the competition? So in these owners' meetings, we discussed these things pretty openly. And if that didn't work, then we resorted to things of our own.
Mm-hmm.
But by and large, it cleaned things up pretty well. Rates got down awfully low in one of the rate wars that we had.
Could you survive when you got in those rate wars, or would you take a loss for a while in order to try to get a position, or?
Well, this was primarily on import cargo,
Mm-hmm.
so we held our heads above water on the export end of it.
And then would keep the ship full coming back, because if you didn't have it full, you didn't have anything, huh?
That's right.
Yeah.
$6 cargo was better than nothing.
Yeah.
And it got down that low too for a short
Is
period.
that right? My goodness. What's normal? I mean, when you say $6, what it's compared to 30 or
30,
what?
35.
Really? Ooh.
From 20 on up.
20 up, huh? Was considered okay, huh? Yeah. Well, I'm amazed that I sent a few little things to Tahiti, you know, a car or something, and there'd be a rate, and then you buy a container, you know, you'd take the whole container was cheaper than,
Yeah.
and then they'd have bunker oil when they were these extra, they'd have surcharges sometimes, and then they'd have more charges, and then next time around they wouldn't have those charges because somehow those were okay again, you know. I guess the oil went down or whatever would happen, you know.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of fluctuations up and down, and you were doing that all the time then. You had to
Well,
stay.
not quite as much as later on, yeah.
Wasn't quite as much then?
No. For instance, the crude oil, fuel oil prices probably didn't vary that much. So that was not too much of a factor. Competition more than anything was.
What did you do? Were your crews, were you American flag ships?
Yeah.
Or they were American flag, not
Right.
Panamanian or?
Strictly. We see, we were subsidized to the extent of repairs. Let's see now what it's. Wages, repairs, and victualling. Everything else we had to pay out of our own pocket. To bring us not even with foreign competition, but, you know,
Mm-hmm.
to the point where we could compete with proper management and so forth. So the American flag lines were subsidized at that time. Not all of them, you know, some chose not to be
Mm-hmm.
and played the market, but they didn't last.
Mm-hmm. What are the big steamship lines now? Just out of, are there-
Sealand is probably the biggest.
they are the biggest.
American President Lines is perhaps next in line. I'm talking American flag now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it.
Matson doesn't exist, or are they?
Strictly Hawaii.
Oh, I see. They're not worldwide or Far East.
The rest are all foreign lines.
Yeah, when you drive over the Bay Bridge down there now, you see a lot of foreign lines in there, you know, all becoming containerized. Some of them still aren't,
Yeah.
but most of them, 99% are now.
That was another evolution during my days with Williams Diamond and American Mail Line, ultimately. When containerization started very, very early on, we, American Mail Line, bought probably 100 of the containers that were 6 by 8.
The small ones.
Yeah. Now they're 40-footers.
Yeah, I can remember us bringing scotch in now they have the big 5,000 gallon, which are the big tankers, and they used to be these little ones, and they're passé because you have to handle 2 or 3 instead of 1.
Precisely.
And because of that, they've actually sold those little tanks to wineries to use in the winery.
Now, containerization was forced on us because of high labor costs, stevedoring and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
We argued with the stevedores, you know. We had to find ways and means of cutting costs ourselves or minimizing them. But even with containerization, the contracts with the longshoremen contained certain provisions that they lost a lot, but
Almost like feather bedding. Was there a little bit of that where they were protected, even though they had a job even though they didn't work, type of thing, almost?
slow downs, you know.
Yeah.
Instead of 1 day loading a ship, they take 2 days.
That's
But
fascinating.
the evolution was from general cargo in individual packages, et cetera, on into smaller containers and then ultimately into the big ones.
I
So
noticed.
we had to replace our fleet in American Mail Line. We had these war surplus C3 vessels. We replaced them with larger combination general cargo and container, and then ultimately fully container.
Now there's nothing but container on there.
Yeah.
I was amazed. Christian, you know, who in Tahiti, when we were there last summer, he had worked on the Astrolab, which was he was the captain of the Astrolab, which was the boat, the government boat that went out and performed government duties. They've closed that ship down a year ago, probably. So for a while, he just wasn't working. He was retired, or a year and a half ago they did it, and he was retired for about a year. And then last summer, he was going crazy, and he needed a little money, so he went back to work. And he worked on the ships that went from Papeete to Raiatea to Taha to Bora and then back, you know. And so we saw him on the ships, and they even have probably a 4 by 4 by 4 little container that you can load. Then you just pick that up now. I mean, they're getting a little bit of containerization even there, you know. But you still see them pick up a load of lumber, pick up a bunch of sacks of cement or whatever. They even have slings if you don't have them in those containers. But they at least are getting those little 4 by 4. They're like wire, you know, open sides and everything. And you can see why, because they can unload a ship so much quicker now, and time is money, I guess, you know. And you don't have a guy putting 20 sacks of cement on his shoulder to get him off the ship, you know.
You know, when I first arrived in Honolulu for the War Shipping Administration, there was a lot of general cargo handled on it. Containerization was non-existent at that time. And the longshoremen on the waterfront was a kick. There was competition between the Hawaiians and the Japanese, local-born Japanese. And these Hawaiians were really something. You'd get going, and they'd get singing, and you could almost feel it.
Vibration on the pier, huh? They could see who could go the fastest
Yeah,
and who could
yeah.
do the best job, huh?
Yeah,
Isn't that
it was
something?
great.
Yeah.
We
Well,
encouraged them.
Did you have a lot of thievery and stuff when you were running the American mail operation?
Not so
When you
much.
had the general cargo? No.
Some cargo was pilferable, For instance, when I joined the American Mail Line, one of the my voice is getting dry. One of the accounts I brought with me was Sunkist, and we moved oranges from Los Angeles to Seattle to the Far East. This was a pilferable item. So what I did was propose, and the company approved, that with each consignment of oranges, we got and paid for a dozen cases of oranges. When it came time to load those to the ship, a given ship, the dock superintendent would announce to the stevedores in the meeting before they started loading. Now, these shipments of oranges have to arrive at destination intact. Please don't break into them. But over here are half a dozen cases which we have bought. You can help yourselves there, but don't touch the cargo. And it worked like a charm.
I believe that.
Yeah.
I believe that.
Some were greedy and took 2 or 3,
But still,
they controlled themselves.
Sure.
They said, hey, wait a minute.
yeah, they were giving that to us, huh?
That's right.
Well, that was very, very good idea. Of course, I worked in the liquor business, and that is a pilferable item.
Yeah.
And what would happen is they had a very simple way of doing it. They would unload 1,000 cases, and they had to hand stack them off and all this. They'd drop 2 or 3 cases. Well, you'd break 2 or 3 bottles in there, and then the rest were, well, they're no good now, so they'd take those other nine bottles home. VO, 7 Crown, whatever it happened to be. Then, of course, you got the containerization, and they would cut hole in the top of the container and go down in and steal. They do that. Or I had a friend in Orinda who was with the customs department, and they used to really watch for this. They would steal a whole container, and they'd bring it outside, and then they'd open the back door and they'd load it into other trucks. And then the trucks would disappear and the container would wind up empty. And they'd take the whole truck. Well, he caught one of them one day. They were doing it right outside the Oakland Pier. And he come up with his gun and he radioed. He said, I need help. And he went up and he nailed them right there. They put them all in jail. But what they would do is actually steal the whole container, and so you'd lose them. But it's amazing. Pilferable items are really,
yes.
You're right. There's certain things. They wouldn't want to buy stinking leather that needed to be tanned, right? Those
That's
that
right.
you used to have.
Hides.
The hides were not pilferable.
Green salted hides.
Well,
That was one item we used to ship pretty heavily into coastal.
uh-huh.
And as you know, they ooze a lot of goo and stuff. So we had to set aside on the dock in San Francisco a special section where the green salted hides would be stored until time to load them.
Mm-hmm.
And whereas we started initially handling individual bundles, we built crates or containers about that deep, 8 by 10, so to speak. So when the hides were delivered, they were plunked right into these semi-containers, you might say, and loaded that way. That expedited the loading. Pleased the stevedores, they didn't have to handle these individually.
Yeah. And did it catch a kind of a drip that used to be on it? Is that
Well,
right?
we slatted, so.
So it would drain through. Because you didn't want, otherwise that would build up even more odor probably, huh?
That's right.
Because I can remember here in Seattle one time you took me down there and that was a terrible odor. To go back,
We're a long ways off from family.
well, but it's interesting because that was your work. I find this fascinating because it's, and I was just thinking of going back to Berkeley, but to know the work you did and what it involved and all that's part of family too, It's like my work as a brother or what Nina's doing now is kind of interesting stuff. But when you lived in Berkeley, you lived there for, golly, 30 years probably, huh? Almost.
Almost.
Almost. No, not quite. But
No,
anyway,
no. 25 at least.
25 at least there at Unis. Did you when did the Moyles, Mrs. G and Gustav come up and visit you in Berkeley? Did you used to see them occasionally, or did you go down? You go down there to
We'd
visit?
go down during the summer quite often, but they never came to Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Gustav liked to travel very much. He was. I remember going shopping with him on Saturdays, which was a big day.
In
Fresno.
In Fresno.
And he was very tense when he was driving.
He kind of enjoyed having worked, I'm sure, in Tahiti in that
Yeah.
business, that was that was really work, like you did in the steamship business. It was buying, selling,
Yeah.
dealing with people all the time. And when he retired, that was a farm life. That certainly wasn't what he did.
Yeah, terrible change.
Terrible change for him.
Of course, when he moved to the States, he went to work for, who did he go to work for? Dad got back into the import-export business there.
In San Francisco.
Yeah. Until the family joined them, and then ultimately he moved to Fresno and bought the ranch and so forth. I'm not too clear on the length of time he was working in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that, incidentally, is where he met his second wife.
Mm-hmm.
She was a musician playing in a band down at that German restaurant opposite the Emporium. What was it called?
Hofbrau.
Something like that.
Schroeder's Hofbrau, one of those, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So to answer your question, no, they didn't come up to Berkeley. We went down there.
And I understand Nunu told me that when you proposed, the two of you went down to talk to him.
Yeah.
Tell me that story. That's
Of course, I was feeling my way,
Yeah.
step by step through there. And she got a little impatient with it, the way the thing was processing. I was comfortable, and so was her father. And she finally said, well, come to the point, we're here to get your blessing. Yeah.
And he said, okay.
And then he told us the story about before he married her mother. He was single, of course, when he went out there from Germany.
Uh-huh.
Seeing my Aunt Lottie, she was a redhead and good-looking gal,
Yeah, yeah.
And she was one of his acquaintances.
Uh-huh.
I won't say girlfriend.
Well, it might have been a girlfriend, sure. That happens with young folks,
But then Henriette's mother came along, and
Mm-hmm.
those big eyes, brown eyes.
Well, she said that when you two talked, even though she might have been impatient, that her dad was really happy to
Yes.
know you because you were from Tahiti. And is that, could you kind of
the relationship that he had with the family, sort of knitted together.
knitted together and made it nice, huh? Was he a very stern person to you?
No.
No? He
Just
wasn't
natural.
natural?
Yeah, just like you and I talking.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting man. He
Yeah.
a lot of different interests.
Very definitely. What I was particularly interested in was talking in the old days as the SCO,
Sure.
So we used to go down there. Summertime, we occupied one of the little guest houses,
Mhm.
cabins,
Mm-hmm.
outside next to the home, rather. Yeah, the good old days.
You kind of heard a lot of the stories then of what he did in Tahiti. The work he did. He talked much about that.
Not too much.
Uh-huh.
He was a little bitter the way the French had handled
I'm sure of that.
dunked him on that island, right at the pass there. And
Uh-huh.
try to picture them as criminals, not criminals, but undesirables.
Sure.
But they permitted him to, as the others permitted him to leave, and he went to San Francisco. He had friends with whom the SEO, had dealt.
Like the Williams
Yeah,
Diamond
yeah,
connection for
yeah.
your grandfather?
I'm trying to think of the name of the firm that, I think it was Atkins Kroll.
Mm-hmm.
Kroll was a German.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Atkins Kroll.
K-R-O-L?
K-R-O-L-L.
K-R-O-L-L.
Yeah, it was Atkins Kroll.
Uh-huh.
Like me, he tied in with the company that
Sure.
we were associated with.
Yeah. I wonder if that bitterness just told him to get out of that kind of business, or whether he just thought maybe that the farm would be more peaceful and quiet and
I think the latter.
more like Tahiti maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he went through some tough times on the farm too. I don't know when he bought the place, whether he had paid for it in full or whether he had to get a bank loan.
Mm-hmm.
That part we didn't discuss. But I know in the latter days there was an attorney in Fresno whom he had to see every Saturday to get funds, shopping.
Hmm.
So whether that was a loan or whatever, anyway, that attorney and his son ultimately got the place when they moved off into town. They got a settlement of some kind from him,
Mm-hmm.
but nothing like what the land was
What the
worth.
land should have been worth.
Nothing.
Do you remember when they moved into town? Nunu doesn't
Not
remember.
precisely.
I'll ask Rita because
Yeah,
she was living
Yeah.
with them then, and yeah, because I remember they moved into Butler Avenue, and I can remember visiting
Yeah.
there. And the farm I
Did
only
they buy the house or rent it?
I don't know. I don't know that either.
Yeah.
Maybe only had to rent it. I can remember as a little kid when we were at Epstein's next door, and I can remember going over there, but I kind of remember it being a very harsh, cold, stern
Well, he had
relationship, and of course, you being older, that wouldn't frighten you, but me as a
No.
little kid, it must have frightened me,
Yeah.
And I can remember my dad not wanting to talk about it, so I had the feeling that there were some things some things that were not good, and
I
when
think it came from the
Stepmother.
new mother-in-law.
stepmother, yeah.
Well, she had her mother there,
Oh, her mother was there as well. Mrs. G's mother was there living with them? Uh-huh.
So when things got a little tough, they
Yeah. Well, Nunu mentioned that, like Babe went away and lived with someone else, and
ultimately
Bill.
your father, maybe he wasn't quite ready to get married, but he did.
Sure. Sure. And my Uncle Bill went off, did not finish school, I guess, and
Yeah.
so.
But he did all right in the final.
Oh, sure. We all survive. I think, everyone does all right, but it's always interesting to see the problems and difficulties, because that all helps frame your
Yeah.
life, the rest of
Sure.
your life, and so I that's kind of some of the interest I have in seeing the way the relation there in the family, and
I never got to know Bill at all. Frenchie and Max were
Mhm.
two that
Yeah, you used to get to Fresno now and again.
particularly Frenchie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, almost every summer we were
Sure,
down there.
sure. And I used to love coming up and staying at Eunice with you folks.
Yeah.
We'd hop on the red train and go over to the fun house and the
Yeah.
cliff house and all that. And
Yeah.
I can remember being with Ellie when the war ended, VJ Day. We were down blowing ocarinas on Shattuck Avenue with all the crowd that spilled out of everywhere,
Yeah.
and seeing how many crepe Suzettes we could eat in the morning when Nunu made crepe Suzettes. So as I say, that's interesting to hear you talk about going to Fresno and talking, because it would be more like you're having the similar background. It would be interesting. It would be seeing him in one of his real interests,
Yeah.
I understand he was quite a photographer and
That's right.
and developed pictures and all.
Yeah.
Was he doing that even after he lived in Fresno, or do you think that
To a lesser extent.
he didn't have
Yeah.
the facilities
No,
probably as
and-
much?
And the expense too.
Sure,
He had to watch the budget.
yeah. Did they build that house on that property, or was it there? Do you know?
I don't know for sure. Seems to me they built it.
They did build it. I think I heard that too,
Yeah.
that they had built that.
I know he built the cabins.
Uh-huh.
He and the boys built the cabins.
Uh-huh.
There's one down near the entrance to the property,
Mm-hmm.
and then two right next to the home, all of which they built themselves. They had a big barn on the place.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether they had cattle to begin with or not. I don't think so.
Mostly just the grapes and raisins.
But he and your father, as I recall it well, Max to a lesser extent, became very proficient at raising grapes and, watching the calendar to do this, that, and the other thing.
Pruning and thinning and...
spraying and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they managed it. It was a well-managed place.
Did they have how many? 20 acres? Is that what it?
Yeah.
I think it was 20 acres.
I wonder who owns that now, whether that's really still.
I would be curious. I think I might go do a little snooping now that I think about it
Yeah.
some more. Because we drove by and it looked like someone was living there, but even so, I'm still going to go in and say my dad lived here, and
Yeah.
I'm sure they wouldn't run us off, because my kids wanted to see it, and in fact they're going to be fascinated to watch all this. That they really have become more conscious of all this. When you lived in Berkeley, I know Nunu said you loved to go hiking and all that. Did you used to go up into the Sierras and hike? And
Not after I married.
not after you married?
Before we married, my brothers and I used to do a lot of hiking over in Marin County. And on one or two occasions, of course, back in Berkeley, in the Berkeley Hills, there's some good camping areas there.
Sure.
But that came along when I got involved in scouting.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the scouting, the scouts rather had a camp up in the high Sierras, Camp Wolfboro.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I got that experience and so forth. I had a troop for 7.5 years.
Wow.
It was they came to the church we belonged to,
Mm-hmm.
North Congregational Church, and wanted a place to meet. And the board, of course, met with them, and I was on the fringe. I think I was on the board at the time also. Anyway, to make a long story short, we agreed to let them use the big hall we had. It wasn't too long before the scoutmaster announced that he had to resign, and could we furnish someone who might carry on, Well, to make a long story short, I became scoutmaster. Had to take training for it. And,
Sure.
and I used to. That kept me, busy and
Sure.
away from the family too. At
Sure.
times.
Sure.
But during the war, before I went out to Pearl, they had a camp in the Berkeley Hills. The Scouts did. And Irving Waterbury was the camp director.
Okay.
And he and I raised the Victory Garden. And I used to go up there on Sundays and work and bring home a whole big basket.
Sure. Vegetables for the week, huh?
That helped.
Sure.
That's when I went to Pearl, all that.
Yeah.
He was unable to keep it up. He had too many things of his own to attend to.
Was he a neighbor? Where did the Waterburys live? I'm trying to remember. I know I visited them.
They lived at Camp Herms all during the time I knew them.
That's up there in the
Berkeley
Berkeley.
Hills.
I guess maybe I just went up there with you and Ellie and Nunu or
Could
something
be.
to visit them, and I can
Yeah.
remember Mr. Waterbury. Yeah.
And then when he retired, he lived with us in Seattle for quite a while.
Okay.
Then he felt his health failing and so forth, so
Mm-hmm.
he moved back to, where was it? Not in Berkeley. Was it Sacramento or? Anyway, somewhere around there.
In the Bay Area, generally.
Where his eldest daughter was a nurse at the hospital, and he lived with them. And he didn't last long after he went back. He died.
Mm-hmm.
He had heart problems.
Mm-hmm. Ellie just went to the schools right there in Berkeley?
Mhm.
Mhm.
Very short distance from home.
Yeah, you walk, it was
Yeah.
close there, yeah, I can remember. I remember going over and playing at the school.
Kindergarten was just a block up the hill, and then the grade schools were down.
Just down below, yeah. And you moved in 1950, you say, to Seattle,
Mhm.
and,
Then we had her in private school in Santa Barbara for a while.
uh-huh. When you lived in Berkeley, or when Berkeley? Then you came to Seattle in 50. You lived just at that one place right next to Pellegrini? Is that, or did you have two different homes in
We had two different homes, and we had a 7031. We bought that from the lumberman. No, the second one was the lumberman. Who did we buy? Anyway, we had 7031. And at one time, Carol lived with us there.
Oh,
We
really?
took her in.
Oh.
And then she moved back to California. She had a good job in Seattle.
Oh.
Then we wanted an extra bedroom, so the lumberman was talking about selling, and we put a down payment on it,
Uh-huh.
and that didn't deter him. He was talking about selling, to other people too. I mean, one of our neighbors, immediate neighbors, came to me one day and he said, "Are you interested in buying the?" What's his name? Anyway, and I said, "Yeah, we put a down payment on it." Oh, he said, "Well, that settles it." This fellow hadn't told him that we had put a down payment on it.
He was going to sell it to him again, huh?
Yeah. So I went to, forget his name now, I'll think of it. And I said, "When can we?"
Close, huh?
I had made my arrangements for the bank account by then,
Mm-hmm.
so I forced the settlement quickly.
That's the one that looked over the bay, over
Yeah.
the
And
lake.
just about 2 houses up from where we were, 7045.
Oh, so you were it was that close? It
We
was,
remained in the same,
I got you, okay.
so it was easy moving.
And when did you buy the property up here then?
Here,
Yes,
56.
so not too much later.
That was an interesting story. The family, Frank Kugelberg's wife, came from this area.
She was a school
Maybe.
teacher here. She told me the story.
That's
yeah.
right.
Go ahead, because I've heard
The family owned this place. She was born and raised in the guest house.
You're kidding.
Amy Kugelberg was born and raised in this little guest house.
I'll be darned.
We've raised it since then.
Yes.
And she and her brother-in-law had been sharing in the rent from this fellow who grew strawberries, whose name I forget. And he had 2 bad years, and one of them really broke him. So the place was up for sale. And we made an offer to buy it. And make a long story short, we got the place in 56. So we improved the little house.
35, 38, 37 years ago.
Yeah,
Time flies, huh?
yeah. And then, of course, that was too small for Ellie and the coming up family. So we built this place. We did a lot of work ourselves, the Bennetts and I. I used to come up every weekend,
Mhm.
Saturday and Sunday.
Ellie got married in 60?
Thereabouts, yeah.
Let's see, 60. That'd be about, well, no, a little earlier because Joan is 33, going to be
Yeah.
33, so it was 58, 50.
Yeah, they didn't have Joan for a year or 2.
So maybe they're married just 57, 58.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So we built this place. Initially, it didn't have the family room, which we added before we moved up here.
Mhm.
It should have been a little larger. This was this floor plan was taken out of a magazine, which it fascinated us a little bit,
Mhm.
If we had to do it over, we'd get larger bedrooms,
Mhm.
but anyway, that's what we did. But we did a lot of the work ourselves. When it came to the interior finishing, stucco and all that, that was done professionally.
And there's how many acres just on the original?
17.
17 acres on the original piece. And Chuck has since bought next door.
That was from, that's not part of the.
No, I understand,
Yeah.
but that's how many, 10?
10 here, and then he had the Bennett farm, of course, that
Yeah.
surrounds us.
And that's how much about?
Ooh, 40 something?
40 something. So the Bennett's had about 40, then you bought 17, and then Chuck has since got another 10.
The Bennetts may have had a little more than 40.
A little more than 40.
You'll have to ask Chuck.
So it's been a nice retirement up here?
Yes, it used to be a very quiet, nice place to live. Now it's creeping in on us all
Yeah.
around, you know.
Chuck had showed me, driving around.
Yeah.
Just noise and people and...
It's becoming a regular thoroughfare, this Bennett Road. It's a shortcut. What they're going to do is widen 20, however.
Mhm.
And during the time they're doing that, we'll probably get more traffic here too.
But then
So, yeah.
eventually it'll be less. Then.
Yeah.
And you've been very active in the Elks. You were active actually in Seattle in a lot of the clubs. What was it? The
Well, the athletic
Washington
club.
Athletic Club.
Yeah. And the Rainier Club. Why I'm maintaining those memberships, I don't know. I probably should give them up.
Tried to get Chuck interested, but he wasn't probably, huh?
Strictly a country boy.
Yeah.
Doesn't like to dress up.
Yeah. And then here you've been active in the Elks. You and Nunu.
I served on the board, and then
Twice even, didn't you?
they were having problems before, shortly after I joined the Elks with the bingo end of it. What was happening at that time, the manager was also the bingo manager. And it was just not a serious money deal, you know. And the board at that time decided that something had to be done to bring in more revenue from what sources they had. And I was approached to become manager of bingo. They had been grossing, I guess, over the year, less than $5,000. Not even that. So I took over, and the first month I took over, I made $750 profit. When I left 7.5 years later, we grossed annually grossed 65,000 net, gross net. That saved the lodge.
5,000 a month.
Believe it or not, that bingo operation saved the lodge.
Wow.
We'd have nights when we had 400 people in it.
My goodness. My goodness.
Then the Indians built out here.
Build out here. Yeah.
And that hurt us quite a bit.
So what? They still have bingo
But
though?
now, yeah, but now that the bingo at the Elks is gradually coming back, we're grossing about 1,200-1,300 a night. You play one night a week.
Mm-hmm.
So we're getting back to the old gross that I was talking about.
Mm-hmm. 65. You're getting back to that.
My
isn't it?
goal was 1,350 a week, gross net. Now they're exceeding that sometimes, and they're not getting quite that. So the averaging out, they're just
Pretty
about
close. Pretty close.
pretty
Yeah.
close.
And that's one of your major sources then of maintaining the lodge. Well, and if you get a new manager that's a little spunky like this fellow, that might help again too.
He's going to be a godsend.
Yeah.
Many people are coming back now. He's gotten the cost controls in effect. When I was on the board, it was obvious to the businessmen on the board, that what we had to do was control our costs. And I made a study based on the experiences that the athletic and Rainier Club had had, very close to the managers in those clubs, and devised a cost control study of our own for the lodge. We started implementing it before my term of office as chairman of the board expired. But the exalted ruler who came aboard considered himself an experienced businessman, but he wasn't at all. He, make a long story short, emasculated
Oh my God.
And the thing went back to where, Now with this new manager, I unearthed the old cost study. Of course, times have changed a great deal since then. One of the things, for instance, I advocated was computerization, which we now have and didn't have then, and really concentrate on controlling your costs in the dining room and the bar. He's accomplished that in the bar, where costs were running 30–40%. They're now down to 19, which is where I projected they should be. The dining room is gradually coming back, so we're instead of 45–50%, he's got it down, coming down now. Our goal is 35% max.
Well, and unless you have a good clientele, it's hard to keep it down because you have some fixed costs that you can't do anything about, right?
Yeah.
And so
we have union, the place is unionized.
Oh.
But gradually he's working around that too. But he's very competent, he's very experienced, he's had important jobs like this before, and he's very personable. People like him. And he knows how to handle people. He knows how to handle staff in the office to get results.
That's good.
We have computerization now, and we have an excellent controller, a woman, who helps him tremendously. We have to watch, in addition to bingo, we have pull tabs, and that has been, we've had some problems there. A month and a half ago, we discovered that we were short $1,200 in the pull tab account. Somebody had appropriated proceeds. The Gambling Commission is in the middle of investigating that problem right now, and we'll have a decision from them, hopefully before the month is over. And perhaps somebody's going to be out of there who's involved in bingo and pull tabs. But in the meanwhile, I'm serving on the audit committee with a businessman from Burlington. And when we discovered we were short this money, the board approached the audit committee to come in and sort of check things over and control it if we could. So what I've done, I've gone for a period of 2 weeks. I went in there every morning, and with the controller we counted the cash and set up the tills for the day's operation. And this thing is leveled out to where the maximum shortage may be $1 or $2. It was running 30–40. And
somebody had sticky fingers, huh?
And
will this manager now, he will control that? Does he control that? Will you say you set up, or does he have someone who is responsible for that? I'm just curious.
actually he doesn't, but the board is,
The board has a person that's responsible to the board.
That's right.
So that person is the one that may be gone, then, is what you're saying. Yeah. It's the old thing, like when we owned the ice cream store, you had to count the till before, count the till after, every day, sign your papers. Because even the kids, sticky fingers. We even had to watch for a guy who would sell a pie, ice cream pie.
Forget to ring it up.
Forget to ring it up, and the money went in his pocket. We caught him. we set up a buy, and then immediately we stayed across the street. As soon as the buy was done, our friends went in and bought a pie. We went right in after. Dinah went in after. Said, "Excuse me, I need to run the." So she ran and saw what got sold. It was not on there. We checked the till, and the money wasn't in there either. And so we fired him. Boom, just like that. Sad part was he was the son of a friend. It's one of those things. But shucks.
People are crazy to do things like that.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
This woman who's been involved in the pull tab operation, cashiering, counting cash, and so forth, is also the cashier in the bingo and pull tab and bingo operation. Now, that operation is clean because the manager of bingo co-signs the paperwork,
Uh-huh.
but on the other, nobody co-signs it. So that's another thing for my reason for my coming in.
Uh-huh.
But she has had, in the last 2 months, 2 garnishments against her wages.
Mm. So
And all
she's-
this adds up, you know.
Sure,
Is she responsible for the $1,200 shortage?
because she needed it for something. Yeah. Well, this has been very interesting, Uncle Hiram.
We got pretty far afield.
We got pretty far afield, but it's been very interesting. I'm just thinking, anything else that comes to mind to
Well-
you that you may have thought about and passed over, and
Of course, my biggest concern now is getting our financial situation. You know, we were affected by this Merrill Lynch. I don't know whether you read about it, but this broker, who was the top broker in Merrill Lynch, stole money from us, actually stole money. So I'm struggling to get that straightened out. We recovered some from Merrill Lynch, but we didn't recover a substantial portion which she had stolen. She's now in jail on 17 counts of grand theft and one of forgery. Whether we can hope to recover anything from her after she comes out, I don't think so. I don't know.
mhm.
For a long time, I suspected she may have salted some of that away, you know, for the future.
Mhm.
But the attorney points out that she's been selling all her personal things, clothes, you name it, and probably it's hopeless to hope for any recovery there. That was a nasty blow that I had to take. So I'm very interested now in getting this Tahiti thing settled so that I can dispose of 6,000 square meters up on Pine Hill, 10, 11, 12,000 per square meter, and sort of set things up. What I have to worry about is
Mhm.
getting things organized so that should I disappear from the scene,
Mhm.
the family will be cared for.
Mhm. For Joan and
Yeah.
especially. Mhm.
Now, Joan, of course, is going to have a guardian for the rest of her life,
Mhm.
and that's one other reason why I have to make sure that we can provide that, because anyone who would be a guardian for her, we'd have to figure on paying them, you know, a wage, because they'd live here with her, but
Mhm.
I think Henriette talked to Mary A. once and more or less agreed on what it might take to induce her, but
Mhm.
we haven't pursued that.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, the only people we have if something suddenly happened to both of us would be Joan's cousins in Seattle, the Stones,
Mhm.
and that's provided for in the will now.
Mhm.
And I'm changing over to a living trust.
That's a good thing to do.
Can't afford the other.
No, you know, the attorneys get so much of a will from a will, and you still have a will in a living trust. Have you actually done that, or you haven't actually done that?
No, I have a will.
I mean, do you have a living trust?
Not yet. I'm in the midst of this damn Merrill Lynch thing,
Ah.
when I handed it over to the attorneys. And what I have to do is to make a resume of everything we owned, et cetera, so.
You know,
With Ariette getting, you know, this.
ill, sure, it makes it hard.
And
Yeah.
my having to do so much.
Then you got the dengue.
Yeah, that was another killer.
That was another blow.
So 1992 was a total disaster.
So 93, we hope is better, huh?
Oh, I'm sure it's going to be.
Yeah.
Get Mr. Albert out of the way. And
You know how we got into this living trust? We'd heard about it, and Nina bought a book. Have you read
Yeah.
much about? You familiar
we
then?
have a book about that.
Yeah, they're, and what
Put out
we,
by a fellow named Abst, A-B-T-S.
I think that's him.
Yeah.
And what we did was we talked to about 5 attorneys who were into living trusts, and when someone finally told us what we read in the book, that's who we hired. a couple others, God, they were gonna do
Yeah.
this and that and the other. But we finally had a guy who, his deal was, you come in and see me, we got an hour of his time. He has a piece of paper that he writes on, and then he takes a picture of it, and it's like it comes out in a fax, like on a fax.
Yeah.
So every note of everything he told us is on there, and he told us what it would cost us. It was like $1,500. And because we have two different sets of kids and
Yeah.
my separate property, and
Yeah.
you know, for my mother-in-law, we want her to do it too, because it would save $20,000 for her kids. And I've told her that, so she's ready to do it, but we just have to work it out too.
Yeah.
But
I guess you have to make an inventory of all your assets, don't you?
that's basically it. But we did that as we went along and talked, and so when we got done, he said, now, you've told me everything. I mean, you know, it was an explanation, but it was also all the information.
Yeah.
By the time we got done, he said, okay, if you want to do it, $1,500, I'll have it ready for you in 4 weeks or whatever. You just go away and decide. And we said, no, we've decided. We said, give us 5 minutes. We talked inside. We said, this is the first time anybody has ever told us exactly what he's going to do and how he's going to do it. We did it, and it's done, you know.
Yeah, it's a big relief.
It is a big relief. Because, as I mentioned last night, our 3 oldest kids, when their father passed away, it's $650,000 worth of property, 99% of it real estate. The probate of that is 8%.
Gee.
That's what, you know, when Carol died, you remember all that got settled? That attorney she had about $80,000 worth, it was the house mostly. 80,000 times 8 would be $6,400, right? 8%. It's about what he got. And Mary A, for being the trustee, got about $3,400. Just for trustee, not her part. And because of the way the law reads in California, and I'm sure it's similar here in Washington, that that was $10,000 out of that. Here, we pay this attorney, well, we know because we've settled one already. Cost David $1,500 to set his up. It cost the kids to put it into practice and to have it all ready. It probably cost them about $2,500. So the $1,500 should have been his bill anyway for setting it up. So the kids, when they inherited all this, paid, let's say $3,000 to be generous. Had it gone through and it's done. I mean, it was done.
Yeah, tout sweet.
It was done tout suite. I mean, it's finished, it's going, and they're getting the income. And if it goes to probate, it sits in the probate courts because they're so full. Sits there for a year before you get any money, and within 9 months you have to pay the government the tax you owe,
Yeah.
or the attorney. And the attorney's bill alone would have been 8% of. It would have been $45,000, and they have no liquidity.
Yeah.
They're getting this little bit of income from the property, you know, a nice income. But it wouldn't have paid a year and a half of that wouldn't have paid the attorney.
No.
And then with the will, people contest. It's all settled. So I'm happy to hear you're doing that. Our experience has been very good, is I guess what I'm saying.
It's urgent that I do that.
Yes.
And now that is in better shape.
Because if either you or her would pass away, things of your will would automatically go into effect,
Yeah.
and you'd be taken by the law today, not by the living
That's right.
trust. Yeah.
So my first priority is to get an inventory of our
Mhm.
possessions and so forth.
Actually, we
Is that
didn't.
what you did?
No, we didn't have all that stuff either. We went to the attorney. The funny thing is, he's an attorney, but he's not the attorney that tries to set it up so he handles it all later to handle your legal. He only handles just the living trust part stuff. If you need attorneys for other things,
Yeah,
they're
I
not.
understand that.
You understand that? So my point was, when we went to see him, he told us exactly what we needed. And then it was much easier for us to get it, because we didn't know really. And I realize an inventory of what you have is probably part of it, but he even suggested to us, well, you don't need that, but you need that, and just bring me this deed, and he accumulated them all in a sense for us. We just told him what we had, and he said, okay, if you have that, I need the deed. If you have that, I need this. And if you give me your insurance policy, and he made it easy for us. We didn't have to go and try to bring more than what we really needed, I guess is maybe what I'm saying. I don't know. Do you kind of have an attorney in mind already, or a?
Well, I have this attorney who defended me in this Merrill Lynch case, and in their office they have someone who specializes in this.
That's good.
So I have to sit down and talk costs, et cetera, with them. I've already alerted them that I want to go to the living trust route, because they say in this state, you know, probate isn't bad and all that, but that's a lot of baloney. I'm thinking of costs also.
Sure. Well, what is probate in this?
I don't know. I didn't want to get into it.
Yeah, and not only that, it's the time it takes.
Yeah. So,
And they're attorneys. They're trying to build up their clientele. You know, I mean, they want some income.
so I'm going to have to be very firm and
That's what I think. Yeah.
I want the living trust route, and what do I do, et cetera, et cetera. Do you, first of all, do you want to handle it or not?
Yeah. Do I go see somebody else? Yeah.
APST has made 2 presentations in this area.
Oh.
I attended the first one. They had a second one recently, which I did not attend. It'd be a repetition. And the local attorney who set it up with them has been after me once to find out whether I've decided, you know, to go this route. I don't know her background or whether she's the person we want or not. But I want to have another frank discussion with my attorneys in Seattle before I...
Have you read that book?
Not totally. I'm about a third.
It would be interesting to read it. Nina made me read it. She read it twice, and she made me read it. And when I read it, and then sat down with him and sat down with 2 other attorneys, we realized this guy was following the EPS plan. I mean, and Nina felt in the beginning that we could do it all ourselves. You know, he says you can in effect do it if you read the book. But it has to be a very simple, and yours is much, much more complicated than ours. But it's not really except that you're going to have a few more little divisions to take care of. But, you know, and all of Tahiti fits in this pot, all of here fits here. So there's just, you may have a couple more spots, but you don't have, you know, it doesn't really get too much bigger, so they have to do more work, so yours might be a little more expensive, and probably rates are a little cheaper up here than they are in San Francisco. You don't know.
Did you go to San Francisco?
No, we did it in Napa.
Oh, Napa.
But it's still $175 an hour. That's our Napa. If we call him on the phone for 5 minutes, it's $37.50. So what we have done is, Nina and I both made a promise that if he calls us on the phone for something, we talk to him for 15 minutes. Ask him how his kids are. We're going to earn that $37.50. Anyway. You know,
Can you think of any other areas?
yes, and it's not a happy side, but when when Ellie was injured here, she was in the little house.
She was living in Burlington.
Okay.
For some reason, she didn't want to stay here. So she had rented an apartment in Burlington, and I took care of the financial end of it, and so forth, paid the rent monthly, et cetera, et cetera. But one morning, she was cooking breakfast, and she had her robe on. Unknowns to her, this was inflammable material. And what happened was the sleeve touched the hot element. And
Flamed up.
And it spread pretty fast too, apparently. You know, it hit her face, of course, which was unprotected. So instead of going to the bathroom and turning on the shower, which probably I would have done, she ran outdoors and was screaming, you know. The neighbor heard her and grabbed a
Blanket or?
carpet and rolled her in this carpet to put the water out. I mean the fire out. We got the call, and she by that time was in the general hospital up in Cedar Lily, and they were working on her at that time. Her face was beginning to peel, you know, horrible sight. But her features were just normal to all intent and purposes. And the doctor, they said, look, this is serious enough, we don't have the facilities to handle it. Would you authorize us to take her to Seattle, to,
University Hospital?
no, the general hospital there,
Uh-huh.
public hospital. They're specialized in fire burns and so forth. So we said, by all means, so they rushed her down there. And we, the children and we went down the next day, I guess it was, and she was in intensive care, and we had to dress in robes and wear masks before they permit us to see her. Her face was all disfigured, you know, swollen, and it was a terrible sight. So we didn't go back there for a while. We kept checking on her condition, naturally. And she came out of that nicely. What took her life was she developed, in the process of healing and all that, an ulcer type at the bottom of her spine. And they contended that to help cure this thing, she had to lie on her tummy. And they had a specially designed stretcher, I guess you'd call it, bed type stretcher, with a hole at the top where her face would be, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And she would be strapped into that, strapped in.
The rest of her body had healed except
Yes.
for that spot?
No, it had healed all over. But in order to help cure this cyst or ulcer that she had developed, she had to be
Upside down.
upside down. Well, we had a call in the wee hours of the morning telling us that there were problems and so forth. What had happened was the nurse had left her for an indefinite period of time. When she came back, Ellie was, to all intent and purposes, had suffocated.
Oh my God.
But the fluid, you know, she, in her process of being supposed to be face down through this opening, wasn't quite that way, so that it built up or jammed up on her, and the poor kid just suffocated.
To death.
Of course, she was heavily sedated too.
Uh-huh. So it was hard to react to
Yeah.
what was happening even, huh?
When we saw her the next morning, she was under artificial respiration, but it was obvious that it wasn't doing anything. Her body was cold, and you couldn't feel any pulse, nothing. So I called our family doctor, Hutchinson,
Uh-huh.
and
Fred.
asked him if he would come over, and we waited for his answer, and he said, Hiram, she's gone.
Sad, sad.
So just a horrible death for poor Ellie.
Uh-huh.
So we had her cremated immediately, and her
Mhm.
ashes brought up here and buried with her husband up here,
Mhm.
Mount Vernon.
Yeah, Chuck showed me. We drove by there yesterday. So, and that sore was a result of her having been in bed a long time, huh?
Yeah,
You get like an ulcer from.
yeah.
I wound up with one right at the bottom of my spine when I had my 5 weeks from my
Same
heart.
damn thing.
Same damn thing. And fortunately, mine healed, but it bored. It like bored in.
Yeah, that's what happened.
And that's what happened. So it was not the fire. She survived the fire.
She survived that.
And was doing well. I mean,
Yeah.
she looked okay.
I'd go in to see her occasionally, and she'd be walking down the hallway, you know.
My goodness.
So that was
I
all-
thought it was a result of the fire
No,
only
no.
later. No. Infection as a result of the fire. It was as a result of being in the hospital.
That's right.
And then she suffocated. That's sad.
Unnecessary, uncalled for.
Unnecessary.
Lack of attention on the part of the nurses. Well, the attorney wanted to sue them,
Uh-huh.
and maybe we should have. Do away with that damn type stretcher, you know.
That thing, sure. Yeah. Well, I know it's funny, but you don't, you weren't, and I wasn't raised on suing over something. When my mother was very sick, I was telling the guy I see for counseling that you know, she would go into a depression, and we took her to the county hospital and they give her medication. And what happened, the medication caused her to go into a 107-degree fever, and she was left partly paralyzed as a result. And he said, "Didn't you sue?" I said, "You know, I never thought about that then." Obviously, there probably was something that, you know, that she wasn't properly supervised and all.
Well, in our case, I think we had a case against her for negligence.
I believe you did, and you know, in what he was telling me was just a couple of weeks ago. He said, "You know, did you?" And I said, "No, I don't know. I was
not gonna bring her back.
I was a brother. I didn't think about that, you know." And in
Yeah,
your
yeah.
case, you say it's, and we weren't tuned. I'm not tuned, and you're not tuned to go out and every time something's wrong, you sue. I think it's even horrible that we do that today so much. I mean, there should be maybe a fair compensation, but what it is, it's like you have to go sue because, you know, it's like this E. coli now. Apparently there's some attorney now that wants millions and millions of dollars. I mean, there should be something for that's sad that those children are dead, you know, so there should be a just compensation, but we're such a sue-happy society today that,
Yeah.
well, I appreciate your sharing that because I know that's hard. And
You thought it was the
I
fire
thought it
burn.
was the fire, and you know, I just may have mixed it up. I knew the fire was very bad. How long had she had to stay in the hospital? 6 months?
Not quite that long.
Not quite that long.
4
and-
months or so.
And she basically, the treatment
Yeah.
they gave for the skin burns was fine. Had it left her face scarred?
Not disfigured. No.
Not disfigured.
They're very good there with that.
Mm-hmm.
That burn center around is very
Mm-hmm.
well known and very professional. So those are the sad moments around.
Yes, yes. And the scary moments with Joan when she was little. I remember
That
the
first seizure.
the seizure was the first one was really bad, huh?
You had one from here to here over. But then, interestingly enough, after we got all the diagnoses and so forth, it wasn't as serious as we had thought, you know. And I noticed something else recently. The medication, because of the length of time between these seizures, she hasn't had one for a long time, almost 7 years, I guess. They cut back on the medication, they cut it in half. The medication she was taking was, you know, kind of slowing her down and physically and mentally. Now she's much sharper. I don't know whether you noticed it or not, but she's sharper than she was.
Mm-hmm.
And she's worked with things like crossword puzzles.
I saw her in there.
Memory is sharper than it was.
Wow.
She goes around and runs the house, so to speak, with the lights, you know. You should turn off these lights, you know, it's costing money.
It was like a grand mal seizure? Is that what the original one was?
Yeah, petit mal.
Petit mal.
Fortunately, it wasn't as serious as...
As the grand mal would
So
think.
she was diagnosed as 85 to 90% normal.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. The seizure caused that damage at that time when she had the seizure
Yeah.
then?
And the most recent one we had was a month or 6 weeks ago in Bellingham. And favorable all around. You know.
All the tests and everything? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. I know that, you know, that both you and Nunu, my dad, used to always say that the care you took of Ellie and Joan was just, he admired that tremendously because, you know, it's...
Yeah, he got to know Joan too, didn't he?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, he did. He did.
That little scene in the backyard and her plastic bathing pool.
Yeah, used to wade and have a good time.
Yeah.
Well, I can't think of anything else right now. We've got time, and we'll just turn this off.
Yeah, and if we think of anything else, you can...
Yeah, start over again.
After I graduated from school in Tahiti and went to work for my uncle in the shipyard, I lived with Aunt Marianne and Uncle Charlie
That was in the big house
in the
then?
big house. I had the downstairs
Uh-huh.
apartment. And did all the shopping at the market in the morning. Thinking back, I probably would have should have insisted on my aunt giving me a list of what she wanted, you know. But I was supposed to go to the market and look around and buy what sort of left up to me as to what the menu was going to be. And I wasn't competent to do that, you know. And, but anyway, I did my best. And I used to go to Papeete on weekends, occasionally on weekends with them. And while out there, of course, I cruised around the property and talked to the Chinese manager who was there and found out what he had done the previous week. Stuff that my uncle would normally be talking to them about, you know. But this Chinese fellow was very talkative and anxious to build up his rep, I guess. So yes, I lived with him. But then after I left, I used to correspond with my aunt occasionally, but gradually that, you know, dropped off, particularly after we got married.
Mm-hmm.
They came to San Francisco on one occasion and stayed with Charlotte in her apartment in San Francisco. And at that time I spent quite a little time with them. And they went back on board a ship which he was still financially interested in. But I never got close to Uncle Charlie as I was with Aunt Mary Ann.
Mm-hmm.
He was all business, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and plenty on his mind. He had an old Englishman who was his chief accountant, and I got to know him better than Uncle Charlie himself. And a fellow named Vivish. So Vivish had bought some property out at Tuttleball, and I went out there with him a couple of times.
Was he in partnership with Gustav? Was that Vivich?
No.
No? That Nunu might have mentioned there was someone that, when they brought material over that had the designs on it to make parios, that wasn't Vivich, that was someone else, I guess.
Yeah. Vivish was strictly an accountant. Goodman.
Mm-hmm.
He set up the financial structures,
Mm-hmm.
paid the bills.
When you were in San Francisco after you married, did you get to know the Schlags? Schlag, as Rose
Yeah, how
and
did we meet now?
Arno Schlag, I think.
I guess we met through our trips to Fresno. He was down there once.
Ah. Because my dad, we used to visit them even after my grandfather died. And we'd go to San Francisco with my dad and mother. We would go and visit the Schlags. We'd go and have a little...
Was Schlein in any way involved financially with your grandfather?
I don't know that. I don't really know. And Nunu didn't remember especially. You know, I mean, she knew the Schlags, but she didn't...
Yeah.
And there were 2 or 3 other families that she said were kind of part of that German group. Now, whether they were involved here in the business where he had known them or they were just friends, I don't